I hear it said time and again, fitting tubeless tyres is a real messy faff, but actually I'm going to show you how, without any specialist tools or equipment, it can be done super simple and most importantly mess-free. We're going to take this from the ground up, so from a completely bare carbon rim, we're going to set this up with some tubeless tape, a tubeless valve, we're going to fit a tyre and the sealant and cover all the steps to get you ready to ride. First things we need to do, any rim, you need to make sure, whether it's aluminium or carbon, we need to make sure it's super clean so that the tape adheres really well. You can use the sort of acetone wipes or similar kind of degreasers or whatever, but anything basically just to scrub that surface clean from any sort of fingerprints, dirt, oils, that kind of thing. I prefer just an aerosol and a bit of blue cloth because that works really well for me. Just dust on a bit of high-powered degreaser, wiping that through. There we go. Just give that a final wipe. And the good thing with these speed degreasers is that they evaporate super quickly. So you haven't got to wait long for the rim to dry. Just keep wiping that around once or twice more. As you can see, that rim was actually pretty clean. There's almost no contaminants on there anyway, because it's a brand new wheel. So that's your first step. You know you're ready to go with a really clean and contaminant-free rim surface. Now to apply the tape. This is a Stan's rim tape, but to be honest, there's various types of this on the market. It doesn't really matter which one you use. Some wheel brands will supply this with their wheels. Others will come already fitted if you're lucky. But so what I like to do if I'm fitting tape is just to actually snip the corners off. So I'm starting with a sort of a rounded edge. And then I would always start at the valve hole. So I locate my valve hole and I would go maybe a couple of spoke holes past. And that's where I would be beginning to stick my tape. So the first point is just to start sticking that tape into the rim bed, push it down nice and firm there, because you're going to need to pull relatively firmly on the tape as you apply. You'll see why in just a second. So yeah, pushing that down nice and firm to start with. So as you can see there, that's my start point. Here's my valve hole just here. I've gone just past. It's nice and stuck, ready to go. So what I'll do now is I like to hold the wheel between my feet so I've got good control over the wheel, and then I'm actually going to pull the tape off the reel but put quite a bit of tension on it. I'm going to pull back quite firmly and just guide that into the rim channel. And the reason you do that is because it just helps it to pull down really firmly into the centre of the rim bed. And I'll just hold that with my thumb where I stop and go again. So I'm just applying that tension as I go, just checking that we're hitting it nice and squarely all the way around. Now, again, this is going to be manufacturer dependent. Some people will say one layer of tape is sufficient. I would always kind of err on the side of caution with that. A second layer of tape is always going to give you a slightly tighter fit for that tyre, and it's going to guarantee you that quick seal when it comes to inflating the tubeless tyre at a later date. So when I get back to my start point, I'm going to carry on. And actually with this Hope system, they would recommend probably a second lap, if you like. So we'll carry on round with our tape for a second circumference to the rim. Again, I'm pulling with a reasonable amount of tension there just to make sure it pulls down nice and firm into the rim channel. Okay, so here we are now arriving back at the valve hole. This time I'm going to come just past and finish a few inches past the valve hole, and then I'm actually just going to take my scissors there, cleanly snip that off and just press firmly down on that last piece of the tape just to make sure we've got a good seal. Okay, now at this point I'll just run around with my thumb. What you can also do at this stage is take a tyre lever that's got a nice rounded profile like this one and actually use that as well. Saves your thumbs getting blisters on them. Just press that down all the way around with a nice rounded edge of a tyre lever. Make sure it's well stuck. Make sure it's evenly seated as well. You haven't got any that's kind of where it shouldn't be underneath the rim bead, but that all looks pretty good. Excellent, right, okay, so that's the next step done. So at this point, we've got tubeless tape all the way around the rim, 2 layers, and it's evenly seated in that rim bed. Now, locating the valve, that's the next thing. We're going to fit a tubeless valve. There's a tubeless valve. Most of them are the same. It's just a rubber seal that's designed to sit in against that tubeless tape. So I'm going to take the valve cap and the lock nut off. Now, what I like to do here to help me locate the valve hole, sometimes it can be really difficult to see where it is. So I'm actually going to take a very small screwdriver and pop that up through, and that just gives me a little guide. I can see a little dimple that screwdriver is making, so I know where the center of that valve hole is. What I'll do from there is I'll take a scalpel or a standing knife, and actually I'll just press one way, and then I'm going to press across that, just gently push that through the tape. There we go. Okay, so what I've effectively done is just made a little cross in the tape where the valve hole is. What I can do then is just take my valve and pop it through where I've made my little incision, and that gives me a nice neat hole for the rubber head of the tubeless valve just to push into and make a really firm seal against that tape. So press that in with my thumb, not with loads of force, just to locate it, and then I'm going to add my lock ring and screw that up against the rim. Now, at this point, a really good thing to bear in mind is if you force this lock ring really tight against the rim, it's unnecessary. You don't need to do that, but I've seen people cranking this up with pliers or whatever. The problem with that is if you ever get a puncture out on the trail or the road and you actually need to remove this tubeless valve, you do need to be able to undo that lock ring with your fingers, otherwise you'll be stuck. So yes, just finger tight is normally plenty. Just nip that up. That's good and tight. There's the tubeless valve seated in the tape. And we're good to fit a tyre. That's your tubeless setup, good to go. So over to the tyre. Now, I'm a stickler for details myself, so I do like my tyre logo to match up to my valve. So I would also check the direction of the tyre. So this is the right-hand side of the rim. The tyre needs to go in that direction. So yeah, I would start with my logos to match up with my valves, and I'm just going to pop the one side of that tyre on all the way around, like so. Just pushing that on with my thumbs. Now you'll find with tubeless tyre setup, everything's a little bit tighter than it used to be with clinchers. So whereas with a clincher tyre, I'd almost always say there's no need for a tyre lever at all. You can pretty much push every clincher tyre on with your thumbs. You may find with tubeless setups, they're just that bit tighter. Just needs a little bit more patience, and if you have to use a tyre lever, do so, but just be really careful that you're not taking chunks out of the rim strip or anything like that, or damaging the rim strip when you're using a tyre lever. Certainly plastic tyre levers only for that step, no metal tyre levers that could damage the tape. So that's half the tyre on. So we're nearly there. What I'll now do is I'll start again at the valve, and I'll start just popping the second side of the tyre on, working my way around systematically. And what I want to do, now this is a point where there are various different methods for putting tubeless sealant into a tyre. This is the method that I personally prefer. Others will do it in other ways. Some people like to inject the sealant in through the valve. I'm not a massive fan of that. There are some systems on the market that do work quite well, but this I find works for every setup, no matter what. So what I'll do is actually hang the wheel. And you'll see why shortly. It just makes this bit easier. If you don't have a work stand, you can hang it on, I don't know, a branch of a tree, whatever. It doesn't really matter. But yeah, that's basically the situation I want to end up in. So with the bit of the tyre that's still not quite fitted at the bottom. Now I'm going to put in the required amount of sealant. For a gravel tyre, mostly, I mean, it probably recommends on this bottle, yeah, 50 mils. This is quite a wide gravel tyre. It's also the first time that this gravel tyre has been fitted. So actually, I probably would go just a few mil more than that, maybe 60 mils of sealant. Before you pour your sealant into your measuring cup or whatever you're using, give it a good shake. That's important because pretty much every sealant on the market now is kind of within there is little particles which will help to fill up any holes and seal those punctures. You need to mix all that up, make sure you get all that and not just the fluid. So I'm going to just pop in, this is a 60mm measuring cap, so there's 60 mils of sealant. Just pop that back on the bench and just carefully pour in my 60 mils of tyre sealant. Great. So now where a little bit of technique comes in to sort of save you making too much mess. So obviously you've got your sealant floating around in the bottom of the tyre there. So what I'm going to do is just carefully push the tyre on a little bit further until we get to about this point. Then what I'm going to do is rotate the wheel so that the gap is now up at the 12 o'clock position. Now all the sealant is now run around the inside of the tyre and is safely down at the bottom. So you're not going to make too much of a mess when you go to push on the last bit of the tyre. Now this is best done in little chunks, so you don't need to have iron thumbs to do this, just a bit of technique. Just work your way through a little bit at a time, just keep that slack moving. Using the tyre sidewall as you kind of to help you with your leverage. Just push that tyre on and there we go. So now we've got the tyre fully seated both sides, there's 60 mils of sealant in there, tubeless valves fitted, and we're good to inflate. Now, obviously an air compressor is a great thing to have. I have one and it's brilliant for tubeless tyre inflation, but I'm actually not going to use the compressor for this demonstration because I want to show you that you don't have to have one in order to get a tubeless tyre to seat. So I'm just going to grab my standard track pump. This one happens to be a sort of gravel and mountain bike specific pump, which is a good thing to note actually. It's a larger bore, so you're going to get a bigger sort of rush of air per stroke, and also the gauge on this pump, quite conveniently, only goes up to 40 psi. So it means you get much more sort of accuracy with your tyre pressures. So, you know, on a mountain bike or a gravel bike, you're generally using much less pressure. So you don't need a gauge that goes up to 200 psi. Anyway, that's an aside. So what I'm going to do, really useful little tip at this stage, is I'm going to remove the valve core. Now, again, there's lots of tools on the market to do this. This is just a little one I've owned for years. Just wind out the center of that valve. Okay, and just take that out completely. What that does is that gives you just basically a straight up hole through the valve. This will only restrict the amount of air that you can pump in any one stroke. You don't need that in there for now, so just set that aside. You need the best possible opportunity to get air into this tyre quickly, because that's what you need to do to get a tubeless tyre to seat. And as I said, that's where an air compressor would be very handy, but we're not going to use that. So I'm just going to check before I start pumping that the tyre is correctly seated either side of the tubeless valve. So I can see it's not trapped anywhere there. That's the one side, and then check the other side. It's exactly where it should be. And then I'm going to pop my pump on, make sure that's locked on. As I say, this is the moment of truth. We hope that with the standard track pump, a couple of quick pumps just to get it going, and away we go. I can feel that's now caught onto the rim beads. I'm going to keep just pumping that up. You'll hear the tyre seat. Sometimes this can be a bit unnerving. They do pop quite loudly sometimes as they ping onto the bead, but don't worry about that. It's all good. There you go, there's one. So you can see the tyre starting to seat. You can hear it pop on. This one's going to go any second. We're at 35 psi here, so I say don't worry about those pings. And also, if it won't go, you can actually help it to seat yourself, but we'll come back to that in a sec. So now obviously we've got no valve core in here, so as soon as I take this pump off, all the air is going to rush out. So you'll be ready with your finger just to pull the pump off and put your finger over the valve hole. That way your tyre's still pumped up, still seated. Now we need to be a little bit dexterous with our return. So I'm just going to get my valve core. As soon as I take my finger away, I'm just going to insert that in. And wind that in as quickly as I can. Just finger tight for now. There you go, job done. So in a matter of a few minutes, we've gone from a completely bare rim. We've fitted a rim strip, valve, popped the tyre on, no special tools. We filled it with sealant in the way that I prefer. And yeah, now we've got to a point where we could just finish off the seating. So just as a guide, you can see there's a visible line all the way around this tyre, which is sort of the edge of the tyre bead. And you can see how that sits evenly all the way around this rim. And that's a sign that it's well seated until we get to this point here. You see it dips in here, it isn't visible, and then it reappears here. So that's telling me that this tyre isn't fully seated yet, so we need to do something about that. So first and foremost, what I'm going to do is just tighten up that valve core, because that's something we need to make sure that's all snugged up. Okay, now what you could do at this point is probably pump this tyre up to about 50 or 60 psi, and that would be enough to seat that. So that's one way of doing it. The other way is you can actually help it to seat by just using your thumbs. So I'm going to show you how to do that technique. Just pop a bit more air in, because obviously we lost a little bit of air as we were changing the valve core over. Okay, let's locate that bit that's not quite seated. So here we can see that's the bit that's not quite seated. What we might be able to do is just help by rolling that tyre with our hands or pushing with our thumbs. It's still not quite going, so just going to put a bit more air in. Okay, and actually that's done it. So we're now at 40 psi, and that's just popped it out anyway. I heard it go. So that last bit of the job is just to make sure that tyre is fully seated all the way around. And there we have it. So now, one last little trick which I like to do. Some people will say, at this stage, pop the wheel in the bike and give it a good spin or whatever, and that will distribute the sealant within the tyre, which is kind of true, but I kind of feel that's not the best way of doing it. All that happens then is the sealant just gets shoved to the outside of the tyre. What I feel is a better way of doing it actually is to work systematically around and hold the wheel sort of at 45 degrees like that and just give it a little bit of a shake. You've got 60 mils of sealant floating around in there. You just want to splash that around a little bit. So this technique I think just works better overall, because just spinning that up to speed, as I say, just tends to just throw that sealant to the extremity of the tyre. You actually want to spin it around like this and just move it around and splash it about all over the sort of the rim bed and the bead, and just make sure that that sealant is worked around. You can also listen. You know, I can't hear any air escaping from anywhere. We're pretty much good to go. I would say that is tubeless tyre, fitted, sealed, ready to ride.